Throughout history, stability was something that never lasted very long. Life expectancy in the 17 and 1800s was about half of what it is now. Children died from disease at rates exponentially higher than anything we see today, with almost half of children in the 19th century not living to see their 5th birthday. War and violence were a constant, not an abnormality. Yet despite these hardships, humanity persisted, solving problems day by day that would make their children's lives easier. It was a slow process, but we are at a much better place today because of those that came before us and put in the work to improve the world. Today in the West, we're in an unprecedented era of peace and prosperity. We've been able to achieve near constant stability in society, something our ancestors could never have even dreamed of. Sure, there's still war and violence, but it isn't real for a lot of people. Take, for instance, the Russia-Ukraine war. We know it exists and support it coming to a peaceful end, but it often just exists on the periphery of our lives, never actually affecting us in any meaningful way. To put it simply, if you had no idea it existed, you wouldn't suffer for your ignorance and you'd be just as well off as you were before. Unfortunately, this success has made us arrogant. In the eyes of many, we've beaten history. The unspoken belief is that there's little left to learn, and we're on an unshakable upwards trend towards progress. History is seen not as a lesson, but as a way to pat ourselves on the back and to look down on those that came before. The funny thing is, we act proud of how far we've come, yet most of us didn't put in any of the work and can only profit off the fruits of our ancestors' labor. The same ancestors that have given us the life we have were so quick to ridicule and disavow in order to present ourselves as more virtuous. That's not to say we should sweep atrocities under the rug and proclaim that many of their acts weren't immoral, because many of them were. Things like slavery, wife-beating, and violent conquest were evil then and are evil today. But judging historical figures by the standards of today in order to ignore their achievements is wrong too. Many today refuse to celebrate Columbus Day because of his moral failings, but without him, the world would be a much different place. As Neil deGrasse Tyson puts it, Columbus's discovery of America was the most important thing to happen to our society.
We are hunter-gatherers. We haven't settled down yet, early humans. And we're basically wandering, we're following the herds, all right? And then the Ice Age hits. So during the Ice Age, the ocean levels dropped, exposing the Bering Strait land bridge between Asia and what is now Alaska, basically North America. Our ancestors who come out of Africa go into Europe. Some stayed, others kept wandering. Some stayed low above the Mediterranean, others went high. They populate Asia. They keep walking because there's a land bridge there. They don't even know it's a bridge, it's just more land. So they walk, and they enter North America. And from there, that's kind of the only way you can go is south at that point. The weather gets a little better. The Ice Age ends. The ocean levels rise, closing the land bridge, stranding a branch of the human species for 10,000 years. Now you have Europe, Asia, Africa, and North and South America, and they know nothing of one another. Two separate branches of the human species. This is a branch. Had this continued, this is how you speciate. This is why the species on Australia, that's why you have mammals there that have pouches, all right? No other mammals do that. They split off and they evolved their own way. Okay, so 10,000 years is not enough to grow 3 heads or, 12 fingers, but our species is separate. Now, Columbus crosses the Atlantic, makes contact with humans. This is the first time that has happened in 10,000 years. We have rejoined 2 branches of the human species. We are now one common genetic group.
Having a day to commemorate this momentous achievement is not an approval of every single one of his actions. It's just a celebration of a man's efforts that led us to where we are today. Society's premature decision to throw the baby out with the bathwater is a big reason why we are now choosing to disregard history. After all, we're better than them. What do they have to teach us? The answer is quite a lot, actually. As George Santayana's famous quote goes, those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And as we're about to see, we've already repeated quite a bit that we shouldn't have. If you saw my last video, you know that I'm not a fan of gender ideology. One of the things I didn't touch on though is how this ideology has led to experimental drugs and mutilating surgeries being performed on minors. I don't think we should encourage it, but as an adult, you can do what you want. Minors, on the other hand, don't have fully developed brains and can't fully comprehend the magnitude of the decisions they're making. We don't let minors get a tattoo, so why are we allowing and encouraging them to mutilate themselves? Some people, in an effort to stay humble, may say that doctors know best, so they should trust the doctor's knowledge rather than their own misguided apprehensions. Unfortunately for these people, they don't remember history. In the 1930s and 40s, the transorbital lobotomy procedure was introduced, which, if you don't know, was designed to be a therapeutic treatment for the mentally unstable. This procedure involved forcing a pick through the back of someone's eye socket to sever connections in the brain. If that image makes your skin crawl, good, because despite Antonio Egas Moniz receiving a Nobel Prize for the success of this procedure in 1949, it is now seen as barbaric. It wasn't until the 1950s that people started to see the negative side effects of this procedure over 15 years after its introduction. It is estimated that from the 1930s to the 1950s, about 60,000 lobotomies were performed in the US and Europe. 60,000 people whose lives were turned into bad science experiments. This isn't the only time scientists and doctors have been wrong, and it surely won't be the last. When knowing some of the mistakes the medical community has made throughout the years, how can you justify outsourcing your own thinking and blindly trust doctors about procedures no one would have even considered a decade or two ago? We don't all have medical degrees, and sometimes we need to trust our doctors without being able to verify everything he or she says. But when your gut is telling you something is wrong, you should listen. Doctors are just as susceptible to personal incentives and propaganda as everyone else. Right now, there are many detransitioners coming out to tell their story of how they are manipulated into this terrible ideology, with some even suing their doctor for allowing these surgeries to happen. There is also a lot of information coming out about desistance rates, how if you don't give your kids hormones and puberty blockers, there's around a 61 to as high as a 98% chance they will change their minds once they're older. Rather than diving headfirst into a procedure getting a lot of love in the media, be cautious and remember the atrocities that have happened in the past in an effort to avoid repeating them. Because soon, these surgeries on minors will be seen in the same light as lobotomies are today. The topic of propaganda leads into my next example. Everyone thinks they can't possibly be affected by it, but that is a far cry from the truth. We look back to the 1930s, where Hitler was able to convince the people of an entire country that one group of people was responsible for all of their problems. Genocides like the Holocaust don't begin with concentration camps, they have various stages to them. For our society recently, we began to walk down this road with the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Before I continue, I want to say that the atrocities in the Holocaust are leaps and bounds greater than anything that happened in the COVID-19 pandemic. But there are still many similarities between both situations that shouldn't have happened had we learned from history. The Holocaust and World War II are used as a comparison for a lot of things, sometimes unjustifiably so, but many often clutch their pearls and get angry that you would even think to compare something to that time of great evil, regardless if it's a justified comparison or not.
How dare you!
In order to learn from history, we need to make comparisons. Now that it's been clearly stated for those pearl clutchers, the Holocaust was way worse, we can continue with a productive discussion. With that said, the demonization of the unvaccinated caused by the media and governments share many parallels with the early stages of the Holocaust. One of the first things Hitler did when he became Chancellor in 1933 was use emergency powers to limit freedom of speech, the freedom of the press, and the freedom of assembly. When the Great Depression hit America and spread to the rest of the world, Hitler used the struggles caused by this to scapegoat the Jews. Through clever propaganda, he was able to aim the frustrations of the German people at the Jews and slowly move throughout the 10 stages of genocide. People today can't fathom that they would ever fall for a ploy as unbelievable as that. Yet many of those same people were tricked into doing the very same thing during the COVID-19 pandemic. Out of the 10 stages of genocide, a solid argument can be made that we passed 7 of the 10 stages. Classification, symbolization, discrimination, dehumanization, polarization, and denial. Classification should go without saying, as we were categorized as either vaccinated or unvaccinated. Symbolization and discrimination go hand in hand, as people needed vaccine cards to do certain things or go to certain places, and if you didn't have a vaccine card, you weren't allowed to participate. Some people lost their livelihoods if they didn't comply, and in rare cases, others lost their lives. Dehumanization involves denying the humanity of one group by associating them with animals or diseases in order to belittle them. In this case, the unvaccinated were seen as vectors of disease, similar to how Jews were also portrayed as spreaders of disease. The media played a large part in all this and created propaganda to turn us against each other.
I know you're vaccinated, you're the smart ones, but you know there's people out there who aren't listening to God and what God wants. You know who they are.
The unvaccinated people.
My message to unvaccinated Americans is this.
If you are the unvaccinated, you are the problem.
You're the problem.
Condemn them, shame them, blame them.
The only people that you can blame are the unvaccinated.
Frankly, we can't trust the unvaccinated.
They should not be part of polite society.
Lunatics who won't take COVID vaccines walking around lawfully unvaccinated? That's psychotic.
If you're willing to walk among us unvaccinated, you are an enemy.
You have no right not to be vaccinated.
Finally, now that the dust is starting to settle and we're seeing more and more vaccine injuries, we're in the denial phase, where we're told that people always had a choice and that nobody was forced into it.
Misinformation and disinformation is carrying people to believe things that are untrue. And therefore, while not forcing anyone to get vaccinated, the bottom line, proof of vaccination will be required by no later than the end of this month for all federal employees. And by mid-November, enforcement measures in place will make sure that everyone is vaccinated.
These tactics were evil then, and they're evil now, even though the situations differ in severity. Everyone likes to tell themselves that if they were in the German people's shoes, they wouldn't buy into the propaganda and they'd stand up to injustice. Well, now we can see that many of these people would fall right into line had they been alive back then. And this is going to happen again and again until we finally learn our lesson. The COVID pandemic revealed more than just our tendencies to ostracize and discriminate against others who don't fall in line. It also revealed that people will quickly give up their freedom to those quick to abuse it in order to feel safe. Throughout history, it is well known that people with too much power are often corrupted by it and end up doing awful things with it. Authoritarian governments like the USSR and the CCP have existed ever since humans have created the concept of government and have used their power to oppress the people they're designed to rule. This is something we should know very well by now, as people have had to learn this time and time again. There are dozens of philosophical and political texts with a ton of great wisdom surrounding this topic and led to a ton of great sayings that almost everyone has heard, such as absolute power corrupts absolutely, and those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. You'd think that we'd have learned this by now, considering all the wisdom on this topic that has been passed down for generations, but we don't. As soon as people get scared, they kick this wisdom to the curb and demand that the government do something.
A person is smart. People are dumb, panicky, dangerous animals, and you know it.
To which the government then uses as an opportunity to gain power. Thankfully, America's founding fathers realized this and set up checks and balances in our system that many other countries have taken inspiration from. But throughout the almost 250 years of America's existence, governments have been slowly outsmarting the system and amassing more control, taking advantage of each war and tragedy. During the pandemic, many of us once again willingly gave more power to the government. They created harsh rules, only allowing themselves to break them. They didn't tell us the truth, only whatever needed to be said to get the outcome they desired.
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
You're sure of it? Because people are listening really closely to this.
Right now, people should not be walking. There's no reason to be walking around with a mask. When you're in the middle of an outbreak, wearing a mask might make people feel a little bit better, and it might even block a droplet, but it's not providing the perfect protection that people think that it is.
Why were we told later in the spring to wear them when we initially were told not to?
Well, the reason for that is that we were concerned, the public health community, and many people were saying this, were concerned that it was at a time when personal protective equipment, including the N95 masks and the surgical masks, were in very short supply. And we wanted to make sure that the people, namely the healthcare workers, who are brave enough to put themselves in harm's way to take care of people who you know were infected with the coronavirus and the danger of them getting infected. We did not want them to be without the equipment that they needed. We were afraid that that would deter away from the people who really needed it.
I don't know about you, but as soon as I saw Fauci change his guidance in an attempt to control our behavior, I never believed another word he said. Unless you've been living under a rock the last 3 years, you've probably seen dozens, if not hundreds of examples like these. Turns out, when you give governments emergency powers to violate the rights of its citizens, many will be corrupted by this power. Who would have thought? Rather than take these events as isolated incidents, we should see corruption and abuse as the norm when governments have too much power, because thousands of years of precedent have shown us that it is. This isn't the only instance of people being scared enough to freely give the government more power in exchange for perceived safety. Guns are a very controversial topic in America, despite them being key to our success during the Revolutionary War. Without them, we'd still be under British rule. We used our firearms to overthrow tyrannical rule in America and implemented the Second Amendment so we would always have the ability to do so again. In our short history, it seems that we have forgotten the potential for tyrannical governments in our own country, with guns becoming increasingly controversial and the laws surrounding them becoming stricter in blue states. People like Joe Biden think that we don't need guns because we'd crumble under the might of the government.
Well, the tree of liberty is not water with the blood of patriots. What's happened is that there never been, if you wanted to think you need to have weapons to take on the government, you need F-15s and maybe some nuclear weapons.
Not sure if the message of, "we'll destroy you if you rise up, so give us your guns instead," will quite resonate with people. If anything, it shows we need to be armed more. Regardless, it forgets not only what happened in the American Revolution, but in Vietnam and Afghanistan. 2 wars where we outnumbered and outclassed our enemies that we ended up pulling out of after many bloody and costly years. In my previous example of authoritarian governments, I didn't mention that many of those governments severely restricted gun ownership to its citizens, effectively stripping them of the ability to rise up against their tyrannical rulers. While it isn't always the case that a society without guns will lead to authoritarianism, it certainly makes it a lot more likely and removes a vital check on the power of those that govern us. These topics all deserve to be delved into much more than I did here. Maybe one day I'll make a video on each one. But the point was to show the historical parallels of these situations and how we could have avoided many of our modern problems. These are only a few examples of the ways our situation today comes from a lack of historical understanding, and they also reflect much of the cultural divide between the progressive left and the conservative right. Something conservatives do a lot more than progressives do is value history and use it as a guide towards a better future. Sometimes it's taken too far and restricts people from new ways of thinking, but generally, I believe conservatives are wiser for looking to history than if they didn't. While I don't think progressives would completely switch their views and become conservative if they had a better understanding of history, I do believe much of their extremism would be tempered and we'd heal a lot of the divide our country is facing. It's understandable to think that we'll always be repeating our past mistakes, but we don't have to. We can't control others, but we can control ourselves. I'm hoping that by highlighting these examples, each of us can learn to not give up our freedoms to the government when we're scared, to not turn on our neighbors because the media tells us to, and to not put blind faith in experimental medical procedures we wouldn't have even considered just a few short years ago. Rather than arrogantly believe that we've beaten history, we can choose to take the lessons learned by and passed down from our ancestors to avoid the mistakes many of our peers still fall victim to. History may need to repeat itself many times over before people finally learn the lessons they should have from the start, but I believe that eventually, we will learn the lessons we're supposed to. Things look grim right now, but like we always do, we'll come out of the darkness and into a better future. Hey guys, thanks again for watching. I want to hear what you have to say, so leave your thoughts in a comment down below. See y'all in the next one.